Before we begin, I just want to take a moment. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to check out the profile of the Supreme Frank on Reddit. Tonight's stories come from there. Also, check out their brand new book, Puppets of the Pale Light, available on Kindle. It's a horror suspense read I think you'll really enjoy. I'll pin all the links in the comments, so make sure to check them out. And if you enjoy the video, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Now let's begin. I have been driving freight across the country for over 14 years, hauling everything from frozen poultry to industrial machine parts through every weather condition imaginable. When you spend that much time behind the wheel of a massive diesel engine, the highway stops being just a road and transforms into a separate reality with its own specific rules and rhythms. You learn to read the subtle changes in the vibration of the floorboards. You understand the exact moment your tires lose their grip on slick asphalt, and you become intimately familiar with the profound, heavy isolation that settles over the world after midnight. The late hours demand a certain level of respect because the darkness plays tricks on human perception, stretching shadows into strange shapes and turning the hypnotic rhythm of the passing white lines into a dangerous lullaby that tries to pull you into a deep, permanent sleep. I usually push through the fatigue by rolling the windows down to let the freezing air bite at my face and turning the radio up until the static rattles the speakers. But 3 nights ago, the exhaustion felt entirely different. It was a heavy weight pressing down on the base of my skull, blurring the edges of my vision and making the dashboard dials swim in and out of focus. I knew I was becoming a hazard to myself and anyone else who might be sharing the desolate stretch of interstate I was currently navigating. My headlights caught a faded, reflective blue sign announcing a rest area 1 mile ahead, offering a brief sanctuary from the endless momentum of the drive. The facility was incredibly remote, situated in the middle of a dense, sprawling forest that seemed to swallow the light from my high beams completely. There were no gas stations, no vending machines, and no overhead sodium lights illuminating the off-ramp, just a narrow slip road winding into a dark clearing surrounded by towering, ancient pines. I guided the heavy truck down the ramp, the air brakes hissing violently in the quiet night as I brought the vehicle to a slow, shuddering halt in the empty parking area. The silence that followed the engine shutting down was immediate and oppressive, amplifying the sound of the wind moving through the unseen canopy above. I unbuckled my seatbelt, rolling my shoulders to work out the deep aches that always accumulate after a 12-hour shift, and looked down at my phone resting in the center console. The screen showed a battery level of 4%, so I plugged it into the dashboard charger, deciding to leave it behind while I stepped out to stretch my legs and use the facilities. I figured I would only be gone for a few minutes, entirely unaware of the catastrophic mistake I was making by leaving my only connection to the outside world resting on the passenger seat. The air outside the cab was damp and bitterly cold, carrying the heavy scent of rotting pine needles and wet earth. The parking lot was in a state of severe disrepair, the asphalt spiderwebbed with deep cracks where aggressive weeds had pushed their way through the surface to reclaim the space. Across the clearing, sitting at the edge of the dense tree line, was a squat, rectangular building constructed from gray cinder blocks, serving as the only amenity for miles. A single fluorescent bulb flickered erratically above the heavy metal entrance door, casting long, twitching shadows across the cracked pavement as I walked toward the building. The heavy metal door protested with a loud, grinding squeal as I pulled it open, stepping into a space that smelled overwhelmingly of stagnant water, cheap industrial bleach, and years of accumulated grime. The interior was lit by exposed fluorescent tubes running along the ceiling, buzzing with an aggressive, electrical violence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I walked over to the row of stained porcelain sinks, turning the rusted metal handle to splash freezing water onto my face, hoping the shock would clear the lingering fog of exhaustion from my brain. The mirror mounted above the sink was heavily scratched and covered in a layer of dull film, reflecting a distorted, gray version of my own tired face back at me. I grabbed a handful of coarse brown paper towels from the dispenser, drying my hands and face before tossing the crumpled mass into a rusted metal trash can overflowing with garbage. I turned toward the exit, ready to return to the warm cab of my truck and sleep for a few solid hours before the morning sun broke over the horizon. I placed both hands flat against the heavy metal exit door, leaning my weight into it to force the rusted hinges to move, and stepped forward, expecting the freezing night air to hit my face. Instead of stepping out into the cold, open parking lot, I found myself stepping directly into an identical indoor space. The air hitting my face was the same stagnant, damp mixture of bleach and grime I had just been breathing. I stood completely still, my hands dropping to my sides, trying to force my exhausted brain to process the visual information in front of me. I was standing in a concrete restroom block that perfectly mirrored the one I had just attempted to leave. The same row of stained porcelain sinks lined the wall to my left. The same rusted trash can sat overflowing with coarse brown paper towels, and the same aggressive, buzzing fluorescent tubes flickered violently overhead. I turned around, looking at the heavy metal door I had just pushed through, feeling a cold, irrational spike of panic blooming in my chest. I pushed the door open again, stepping backward, expecting to return to the original bathroom or the parking lot, but the door simply led right back into the exact same identical space. My initial thought was that my fatigue had finally triggered a massive hallucination, or that the architectural layout of this specific rest stop was designed in a confusing, mirrored loop to deter vandalism. I decided to simply walk forward, moving past the identical sinks and the identical stalls, aiming for the heavy metal exit door at the far end of this second room. I kept my breathing slow and measured, telling myself that the fresh air was just a few steps away, pushing the final door open with a forceful shove to finally escape the oppressive, buzzing concrete box. The door swung outward, and I stepped through, but my heavy boots did not land on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The ground beneath my feet yielded with a soft, damp resistance, feeling less like soil and more like a dense, fibrous muscle tissue. I stumbled forward, struggling to keep my balance on the uneven terrain, my eyes desperately trying to adjust to an environment that defied every rational law of biology and physics. I was standing in a vast, sprawling forest, but the towering structures rising from the ground bore absolutely no resemblance to the ancient pines I had seen when I parked my truck. The trunks were smooth and wet, composed of a dark, crimson material that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat, weeping a thick, viscous sap that smelled strongly of raw copper and old blood. I reached out a trembling hand to steady myself against the nearest trunk, feeling the warm, yielding surface compress slightly under my palm, confirming the impossible reality that the vegetation surrounding me was constructed entirely from living, breathing organic tissue. Looking upward, the horror of the landscape compounded, completely shattering my fragile grip on sanity. The canopies of these towering, meaty structures did not sprout leaves or branches, but instead exploded into massive, tangled clusters of humming fluorescent glass tubes, emitting a harsh, blinding white light that cast the entire forest in a sterile, hospital-like glare. The buzzing sound coming from thousands of these glowing canopies merged into a deafening, continuous drone that vibrated deep within the cavities of my chest, making it entirely impossible to think clearly. I tilted my head further back, shielding my eyes from the blinding fluorescent canopies, trying to find the night sky, hoping to see the familiar comfort of the moon or the stars. The sky above this nightmare forest was a vast, swirling whirlpool of dark, shifting colors, spinning relentlessly around a massive, empty void situated at the very center of the atmosphere. I squinted against the harsh light, trying to focus on the small, dark shapes that made up the swirling mass of the whirlpool, tracking their spiraling descent toward the central black hole. The shapes were distinct, possessing clear appendages and heads, tumbling over each other in a silent, agonizing ballet as they were sucked upward into the infinite darkness. The dark silhouettes forming the massive atmospheric vortex were undeniably, unmistakably human bodies, millions of them, twisting and flailing without making a single sound, forming the very fabric of the sky above me. A profound, violent nausea slammed into my stomach, dropping me to my knees on the damp, yielding ground. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the deafening buzz of the fluorescent canopies, squeezing my eyes shut to erase the image of the spiraling human shapes from my mind. I needed to wake up. I needed to be back in the cab of my truck, dealing with the simple, manageable problem of highway fatigue, rather than kneeling in a landscape constructed of meat, glass, and eternal suffering. A sharp, metallic scraping sound cut through the continuous drone of the canopy, originating from the shadows between the pulsing crimson trunks. I opened my eyes, slowly lowering my hands, scanning the surreal undergrowth for the source of the noise. The movement was erratic and jerky, disturbing the damp, fleshy ground as multiple shapes began to emerge from the deeper sections of the forest. The creatures skittering toward me possessed the basic anatomical structure of massive arachnids, but their bodies were entirely synthetic, formed from a chaotic, horrifying amalgamation of garbage and structural debris. Their long, multi-jointed legs were constructed from jagged lengths of rusted steel rebar, scraping and clicking against each other with every stilted movement. The central bodies of these spiders were formed from large, jagged chunks of shattered porcelain, bearing the distinct, curved edges of broken toilets and sinks, held together by thick, wrapping layers of filthy, dripping brown paper towels. The creatures moved with a terrifying, unified purpose, their rusted rebar legs piercing the meaty ground, leaving small, bubbling wounds in the terrain as they advanced. They did not have visible eyes or sensory organs, but they were tracking me with absolute precision, their porcelain bodies clattering against each other as they swarmed forward. I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that I was the only purely organic, foreign object in their immediate environment, and the scent of my sweat, my breath, and my fear was drawing them in like a beacon. The paralyzing shock broke, replaced entirely by raw survival instinct. I scrambled to my feet, my heavy boots sliding on the damp, bleeding ground, and turned away from the advancing swarm, launching myself into a dead sprint through the dense, pulsing forest. The air was incredibly thick, filling my lungs with the suffocating scent of copper and industrial bleach, making every breath a physical struggle. I dodged around the massive, fleshy trunks, the blinding glare from the fluorescent canopies disorienting my sense of direction, casting harsh, moving shadows that made the forest floor completely unpredictable. The rusted scraping of the rebar legs grew louder behind me, accompanied by the wet, slapping sound of the filthy paper towels dragging against the ground, confirming that the creatures were closing the distance with terrifying speed. I ran until my chest burned, leaping over protruding veins that snaked across the surface of the ground, risking quick glances over my shoulder to gauge the proximity of the swarm. The spiders were relentless, their jagged porcelain bodies navigating the obstacles of the forest without slowing down. I focused my attention forward, desperately searching the horizon for an end to the trees, hoping to find a clearing, a structure, or any change in the landscape that might offer a chance of escape. The forest stretched into infinity, a repeating, endless nightmare of pulsing red trunks and blinding white light, topped by the continuous, silent suffering of the human whirlpool spinning in the sky above. The realization hit me with the force of a blow, draining the adrenaline from my system and replacing it with a profound, crushing despair. There was no end to this place. Running deeper into the forest would only exhaust my limited energy, ensuring that the rusted rebar legs would eventually overtake me, dragging me down into the damp, yielding ground to be disassembled by jagged porcelain. My only chance of survival, however slim, was to navigate back to the point of entry. I altered my trajectory, using the thickest, most massive fleshy trunks for cover, attempting to circle back toward the area where I had initially stumbled into this reality. I slid behind a particularly large, weeping pillar of muscle tissue, pressing my back flat against the warm, vibrating surface, holding my breath as the main body of the swarm skittered past my hiding spot. The clicking and scraping of the metal legs passed within inches of my position, the foul, damp odor of the rotting paper towels making my eyes water and my stomach heave, but I remained completely motionless until the sounds began to fade into the distance. I stepped out from behind the cover of the trunk, moving with careful, silent steps, retracing my path through the disorienting glare of the fluorescent canopy. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant scrape of metal sending a jolt of panic through my nervous system. But I kept moving forward, desperate to find the familiar gray concrete of the rest stop door. The freestanding doorway appeared in the distance, a completely incongruous structure sitting alone in the middle of the fleshy landscape, attached to absolutely nothing, simply a metal frame holding a chipped, gray door. I abandoned all caution and sprinted the final 100 yards, ignoring the fresh wave of metallic scraping that erupted from the undergrowth as the creatures registered my sudden movement. I threw myself against the heavy metal door, grasping the rusted handle and pulling it outward with every ounce of remaining strength in my body. I tumbled backward into the stagnant, bleach-scented air of the identical bathroom, kicking the door shut just as the first rusted rebar leg stabbed through the opening. The heavy metal slammed against the steel frame with a deafening crash, severing the intruding metal limb, sending the jagged piece of rebar clattering across the tiled floor. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the heavy, overflowing trash can and dragging it across the wet tiles, wedging it firmly beneath the door handle to act as a makeshift barricade. The creatures immediately began assaulting the exterior of the door, their rebar legs scratching and gouging the metal surface with a horrific, high-pitched screeching that echoed endlessly against the concrete walls of the bathroom. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, staring at the barricade, knowing that the thin metal frame and the rusted trash can would not hold the swarm back indefinitely. I spun around, scanning the featureless concrete walls of the bathroom, searching for any alternative exit, any structural weakness that could offer a way out of the sealed box. My eyes landed on a small, rectangular ventilation grate positioned high up on the wall near the ceiling, covered in a thick layer of gray dust and cobwebs. It was incredibly narrow, a tight, galvanized steel duct designed to circulate the damp air, but it was the only physical opening in the entire room that did not lead back to the nightmare forest. The screeching against the metal door grew more intense, accompanied by heavy, rhythmic thuds as the larger porcelain bodies began hurling themselves against the barricade, causing the rusted hinges to groan and buckle. I dragged one of the heavy porcelain trash receptacles over to the wall, climbing onto the unstable surface to reach the high ventilation grate. I wedged my fingers through the narrow metal slats, ignoring the sharp pain as the rusted edges sliced into my skin, and pulled backward with absolute desperation. The screws holding the grate to the concrete wall gave way with a sharp crack, sending the metal cover falling to the floor, exposing the dark, narrow opening of the duct. I grabbed the bottom edge of the opening, pulling my upper body into the claustrophobic space. The walls of the duct pressed tightly against my shoulders and chest, restricting my breathing to shallow, rapid gasps as I pushed myself deeper into the darkness. I heard the barricaded door below me finally buckled, the hinges snapping under the sustained pressure, allowing a chaotic flood of rusted rebar and broken porcelain to spill onto the bathroom floor. I pushed, sliding my body further into the pitch-black shaft, feeling the sharp, galvanized screws tearing through my heavy jacket and scraping against my skin. The crawl through the ventilation infrastructure was an exercise in pure, agonizing endurance. The metal duct offered absolutely no room to turn around, forcing me to continue pushing myself into the unknown, trusting that the shaft eventually led to the exterior of the building. The air inside the vent was thick with decades of accumulated dust, dead insects, and the sharp, metallic tang of oxidized steel, coating the back of my throat and making me cough violently, which only caused my chest to expand and wedge tighter against the unyielding metal walls. I lost all concept of time in the darkness, my entire reality reducing to the repetitive, exhausting motion of pushing backward with my boots, sliding my shoulders against the scraping metal, and praying that the duct did not narrow any further. The panic of becoming permanently stuck, buried alive in the tight metal tube between impossible realities, threatened to overwhelm me completely, but the memory of the swirling human sky and the rusted arachnids provided the necessary terror to keep my legs pushing. I finally struck a solid barrier, halting my progress entirely, causing a fresh wave of claustrophobic panic to surge through my chest. I saw thin slivers of actual, pale moonlight cutting through the darkness, filtering through the slats of an exterior ventilation cover. I braced my heavy boots against the walls of the duct for leverage and drove both of my fists outward, striking the metal grate with maximum force. The cover bent outward on the first impact, the rusted retaining screws screaming against the metal frame, and broke away completely on the second desperate shove, tumbling away into the night air. I dragged my upper body forward out of the narrow opening, losing my grip as my center of gravity tipped over the edge of the duct and plummeted toward the ground, landing heavily on my shoulder in a patch of wet, overgrown grass. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the sky, the freezing night air filling my lungs with the beautiful, grounding scent of wet soil and actual pine trees. There was no continuous, deafening drone. There was no harsh fluorescent light. And most importantly, the sky was completely still, a deep, peaceful expanse of black velvet scattered with the familiar, indifferent points of starlight. I slowly pushed myself off the ground, my body aching from a dozen different scrapes and bruises, pulling debris and cobwebs from my hair and clothes. I recognized the surrounding environment immediately. I was standing in the tall, overgrown weeds directly behind the same gray cinder block building I had originally entered, just a short walk around the corner from the cracked asphalt of the empty parking lot. I staggered up the incline, walking on the cracked asphalt toward the parking lot, my eyes searching the darkness for the familiar shape of my rig, desperate to climb into the cab and lock the heavy doors behind me. The massive truck was parked exactly where I had left it, the dark shape dominating the empty clearing. But as I moved closer, a deep, unsettling confusion replaced the relief of finding my vehicle. The truck was covered in a heavy layer of accumulated dust, water spots, and pine needles, looking exactly like a vehicle that had been sitting untouched in the woods for several days. The windshield was smeared with a thick film of yellow pollen and bird droppings, and the heavy tires were ringed by wind-blown debris and dead leaves that had piled up against the rubber. I pulled my keys from my pocket with trembling fingers, inserting the key into the driver's side door, turning the lock mechanism with a sharp, familiar click. The heavy door opened, spilling a small collection of trapped pine needles onto the pavement, and I climbed into the stale, freezing air of the cab, immediately reaching for the dashboard where I had left my phone connected to the charger. The phone was sitting exactly where I had placed it, but the battery was completely dead, the screen a blank, dark rectangle. I turned the ignition key, praying that the massive diesel engine would respond, feeling a wave of immense relief wash over me as the starter motor ground heavily for a few seconds before the engine finally roared to life, shaking the accumulated dirt from the hood. The dashboard electronics flickered to life, the digital clock glowing brightly against the dark interior of the cab. I stared at the glowing green numbers, feeling the final, lingering shreds of my sanity quietly slipping away into the buzzing silence of the cab. I had pulled into the rest area at approximately 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, fully intending to wash my face and immediately return to the driver's seat. The digital display on the dashboard indicated that it was currently 4:15 a.m. on a Wednesday, not the following day. I checked the date on the navigation system, confirming the impossible reality that my brief excursion into the concrete bathroom, the fleshy forest, and the narrow ventilation duct had somehow cost me an entire week of linear time. I plugged my phone into the active charging port, waiting in stunned silence as the device slowly booted up, the screen eventually illuminating to reveal dozens of missed calls, frantic text messages from my dispatcher, and voicemails from family members demanding to know why my GPS tracker had been stationary in a remote forest for 8 days. I am sitting in the idling truck right now, the doors locked, the heater blasting, staring out through the dirty windshield at the squat, gray cinder block building sitting at the edge of the tree line. The single fluorescent bulb above the heavy metal door is still flickering violently, casting those same long, twitching shadows across the cracked pavement. I haven't responded to the dispatcher yet. I haven't listened to the voicemails. I am typing this out on my phone, trying to force the chaotic, impossible events into a structured narrative, hoping that putting the words onto a screen will somehow make the reality of the situation easier to process. I don't know what happened to me in that building. I don't know if I stumbled into a tear in the fabric of reality, if the crushing fatigue finally forced my brain into a week-long, localized coma where I hallucinated the entire ordeal, or if the architecture of the highway hides trapdoors that lead to places designed to process human suffering. My knuckles are bleeding from prying the grate open. My heavy jacket is torn to shreds, covered in gray dust and oxidized metal flakes. And I can still smell the overwhelming scent of raw copper and industrial bleach clinging to my skin, a physical reminder that the damp, yielding ground was absolutely real. I am completely terrified to put the truck in gear and drive back onto the highway, because I don't know if the road I am currently parked next to is the actual interstate, or just another elaborate, identical layer of the trap. I need someone to tell me they have experienced something similar. I need to know if it is safe to drive, or if I am still wandering through the endless, buzzing corridors, moving further away from the real world with every mile I cover. I am watching the heavy metal door of the restroom block, waiting for the rusted, jagged shapes of broken porcelain and rebar to push it open, stepping out onto the asphalt to finish the hunt. I have been driving delivery routes for independent freight companies for the better part of a decade, moving everything from bulk automotive parts to specialized medical equipment across long stretches of empty highway. You get used to the isolation when you work the overnight shifts, and you eventually learn to find a strange sort of comfort in the steady hum of the tires against the pavement and the lonely glow of the dashboard instruments. I usually listen to long audiobooks or history podcasts to keep my mind engaged while the miles roll by, drinking terrible gas station coffee and trusting my navigation application to guide me to warehouses and loading docks hidden in the industrial outskirts of sleeping cities. I have never been a superstitious person, and I have always dismissed the stories other drivers share at truck stops about phantom vehicles or strange lights in the sky as nothing more than the natural result of sleep deprivation and highway hypnosis. Last night, my dispatcher handed me a rush order that needed to be delivered to a rural medical facility before sunrise, which meant I had to drive a heavy, extended wheelbase cargo van through a highly unfamiliar region heavily dominated by dense, old-growth forests. I was already exhausted from a previous run, but the extra pay was substantial enough to convince me to take the job, so I loaded the pallets into the back of the van, secured the straps, and pulled out of the depot just as the sun was setting. The first few hours of the drive were entirely uneventful, consisting of wide, well-maintained interstates and clear weather, allowing me to make good time and keeping my mood relatively positive despite the creeping fatigue. Around 2 in the morning, my navigation application alerted me to a massive traffic incident several miles ahead on the main highway, showing a solid red line on the digital map that indicated a complete standstill that would likely last for hours. The application immediately offered an alternative route, suggesting a detour that would take me off the interstate and thread me through a network of secondary roads to bypass the blockage and keep me on schedule for the morning delivery. I accepted the alternate route without hesitation, taking the next available exit ramp and following the glowing blue line on my phone screen into the dark, rural landscape beyond the reach of the highway streetlights. The paved county roads quickly gave way to uneven gravel, and the sparse farmhouses I had been passing gradually disappeared entirely, leaving me driving through an environment that felt increasingly isolated and untouched by human development. The navigation application eventually instructed me to make a sharp turn onto an unmarked dirt logging road, a path so narrow and heavily encroached upon by the surrounding vegetation that I had to slow the van down to a crawl just to navigate safely. The thick canopy of massive pine branches completely blocked out the night sky, creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect where my headlights could only penetrate a short distance into the swirling dust kicked up by my front tires. I drove down that dirt road for what felt like an eternity, constantly checking the map on my phone only to see the blue route stretching endlessly forward into an empty gray void with no intersecting roads or landmarks in sight. The cell service indicator on my screen had dropped to 0 bars over an hour ago, meaning I was entirely reliant on the pre-downloaded map data and completely cut off from any ability to call for a tow truck if the rough terrain managed to puncture a tire or damage my suspension. The absolute darkness outside the van was suffocating, while the rattling of the empty metal shelves in the cargo area behind me provided a constant, nerve-wracking soundtrack to the slow journey. I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were aching, leaning forward to peer through the dusty windshield, when my high beams caught a harsh, unnatural reflection standing on the right side of the dirt path just ahead. I instinctively eased my foot off the accelerator, assuming it was some sort of reflective warning sign indicating a sharp curve or a washed-out bridge, but as the van rolled closer, the shape illuminated by my headlights resolved into something entirely different. It was a large, freestanding wooden bulletin board protected by sliding glass doors, the kind of structure you typically see standing near the entrance of a national park visitor center or a community hiking trail, completely out of place in the middle of a desolate logging road miles from any known civilization. The wood looked freshly painted and perfectly maintained, standing in stark contrast to the overgrown environment surrounding it, and the glass panes were completely free of dust or condensation, reflecting the bright glare of my van's headlights with absolute clarity. I brought the van to a complete stop parallel to the board, leaving the engine idling in park and keeping my headlights shining directly onto the structure, driven by a deep, undeniable curiosity about what could possibly be posted in a place where nobody ever travels. I leaned over the center console, peering through the passenger side window to get a better look at the papers pinned to the corkboard behind the pristine glass doors. The board was covered in neatly arranged flyers, and it only took me a few seconds of reading the bold, black lettering at the top of the pages to realize that every single piece of paper was a missing person poster. The faces looking back at me were entirely unfamiliar, showing a diverse range of ages and backgrounds. all printed in high-quality color with detailed physical descriptions and dates of disappearance that spanned across several decades. The sheer volume of the posters was deeply unsettling, creating a grim mosaic of lost lives displayed for an audience of overgrown trees and wandering wildlife. And I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I scanned the rows of smiling faces frozen in time. I was about to put the van back into gear and drive away from the morbid display when my eyes caught something anomalous pinned in the bottom right corner of the board, slightly separated from the neat rows of the other flyers. It was a single, borderless photograph printed on thick, glossy paper, lacking any of the identifying text or emergency contact numbers that accompanied the missing person posters surrounding it. I pressed my face closer to the cold glass of my passenger window, straining my eyes to make out the details of the image in the glare of my headlights, and felt my stomach drop into a bottomless pit of pure, paralyzing terror. The photograph was a crystal-clear image of my exact cargo van, captured from the perspective of someone standing just off the dirt road, looking directly at the driver's side door. I could clearly see the distinct dent on the rear fender that I had caused backing into a loading dock last winter. The specific arrangement of dirt smeared across the company logo on the side panel, and the faint, illuminated silhouette of my own profile sitting behind the steering wheel, cast in the dim light of the dashboard instruments. It was an impossible image, representing the exact moment and location I was currently occupying, but the sheer impossibility of the photograph was immediately overshadowed by the horrifying detail occupying the background of the image. Standing directly behind the rear bumper of my van in the photograph was a figure so unnaturally tall and distorted that my brain struggled to process its proportions, possessing elongated, multi-jointed limbs that hung down past its knees and a torso that seemed stretched and warped like melting wax. The creature was cloaked in the shadows just beyond the reach of the red glow from my taillights, but its face was turned toward the camera, revealing a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin completely devoid of eyes, a nose, or a mouth. I violently threw myself back into the driver's seat and immediately checked the rearview mirror mounted on the windshield, expecting to see the towering abomination standing right behind my vehicle. The red glow of my taillights illuminated the swirling dust and the rough dirt of the road behind me, but the space was completely empty, showing no signs of any massive, distorted creature lurking in the darkness. I frantically checked both of the side mirrors, leaning forward to get a wider angle of the area surrounding the van, but the forest remained still and empty, completely undisturbed by anything other than the low, rumbling vibration of my idling engine. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to convince my panicked mind that I was suffering from an intense visual hallucination brought on by extreme fatigue and the eerie atmosphere of the missing persons board. I forced myself to lean back over the center console and look out the passenger window again, needing to verify that my exhausted eyes had simply misinterpreted a shadow or a strange arrangement of branches in the photograph. I looked at the glossy print pinned to the bottom corner of the board, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. The photograph had changed. The perspective of the image remained exactly the same, showing the driver's side of my idling cargo van, but the tall, faceless figure was no longer standing behind the rear bumper. The creature had taken a massive, deliberate step forward in the frozen image, moving out of the shadows and positioning itself directly adjacent to the rear tire, its elongated, pale hands hanging loosely at its sides. I whipped my head around to look out the driver's side window, staring into the impenetrable wall of darkness pressing against the glass, my eyes wide with a terror so profound it was crushing my chest. There was nothing out there. The dirt road was empty, the trees were still, and the only light came from the reflection of my own dashboard instruments against the window pane. I turned my attention back to the illuminated board outside the passenger window, my entire body trembling uncontrollably as I watched the impossible photograph update itself in real time. The figure in the image had moved again, closing the distance entirely, and was now standing directly beside the driver's side door of my van in the picture, towering over the roof of the vehicle. A sharp, distinct tapping sound suddenly echoed through the interior of the cab, originating directly from the glass of my driver's side window, just inches away from my left ear. I screamed and scrambled across the cab over the center console, pressing my back against the passenger door to put as much distance as possible between myself and the driver's side window. I stared at the glass, fully expecting to see a pale, featureless face staring back at me, but the window remained completely empty, reflecting only the panicked expression on my own face. The tapping sound continued, a slow, methodical rhythm of hard fingernails striking the glass, despite the fact that I was looking directly at the window and could see absolutely nothing outside the vehicle causing the noise. I realized I needed to escape immediately, abandoning any attempt to rationalize the nightmare unfolding around me, and lunged across the seats to throw the transmission shifter into the drive position. I slammed my heavy work boot down onto the accelerator pedal, expecting the powerful engine to roar to life and launch the heavy van forward down the dirt road, leaving the illuminated board and the invisible horror far behind. The engine sputtered violently, a harsh, grinding noise echoing from under the hood, and the entire vehicle shuddered before the engine completely died, leaving the van dead in the dirt. I twisted the ignition key desperately, trying to force the starter motor to catch, but the engine only offered a weak, clicking sound, completely refusing to turn over despite having half a tank of gas and a perfectly healthy battery just moments ago. I looked back at the illuminated board out the passenger window, and the glossy photograph had changed for a fourth time. The tall, faceless figure in the image was now leaning down, pressing its long, distorted hands flat against the driver's side window in the picture, its smooth, pale head angled as if it were staring directly at the silhouette of the driver inside the cab. Simultaneously, two massive, pale handprints suddenly materialized on the outside of my actual driver's side window, the thick moisture condensing against the cold glass to perfectly outline the shape of elongated, spindly fingers pressing against the pane. The methodical tapping instantly escalated into a violent, aggressive pounding, the invisible creature hammering its fists against the reinforced glass with enough force to shake the entire heavy cargo van on its suspension. The metal door groaned under the impact, the window bending slightly inward with every massive strike, and I knew with absolute certainty that the safety glass was going to shatter within seconds, allowing whatever invisible monstrosity was outside to reach into the cab. I scrambled back into the driver's seat, my mind completely fractured by the assault, and slammed both of my feet down onto the brake pedal in a blind, irrational panic, gripping the steering wheel as if bracing for a collision. I twisted the ignition key all the way backward to the off position, completely shutting down the electrical system in a desperate attempt to reset the vehicle's computer, plunging the dashboard and the interior of the cab into absolute darkness. The moment I turned the key backward, the bright, powerful headlights illuminating the dirt road ahead instantly died, completely swallowing the wooden missing persons board and the surrounding forest in a thick, impenetrable blanket of blackness. The violent pounding against my driver's side window stopped immediately. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing and the rapid, erratic hammering of my heart. I remained completely frozen in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they were completely numb, waiting in the absolute darkness for the window to shatter or the metal door to be ripped open. Several minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, and the environment outside the van remained perfectly still and quiet. I slowly removed one hand from the steering wheel, reaching into my jacket pocket with trembling fingers to retrieve my mobile phone, desperate for any source of light to verify that the creature had actually abandoned its attack. I unlocked the screen, ignoring the lack of a cellular signal, and navigated to the flashlight application, pointing the camera lens toward the passenger window before tapping the button to turn the bright LED bulb on. The harsh white beam of the phone flashlight cut through the darkness of the cab, shining through the passenger window and casting a narrow circle of illumination onto the glass doors of the wooden bulletin board standing just off the shoulder of the road. The violent, aggressive pounding against my driver's side window instantly resumed, the invisible fist striking the glass with renewed fury the exact second the beam of light hit the surface of the board. I immediately jammed my thumb against the screen, turning the phone flashlight off and plunging the world back into total darkness, and the pounding ceased just as abruptly as it had started. I sat in the pitch-black cab, the horrifying realization slowly forming in my mind as I connected the cause and effect of the creature's behavior. When my headlights or my flashlight revealed the board, the creature was able to hunt, but when the light was extinguished, the entity ceased to exist in the space around my van. I could not simply sit in the dark forest forever, waiting for the morning sun to rise and permanently illuminate the board, bringing the creature back into the physical world with no way for me to turn off the sun. I had to drive the van away from this location, putting miles between myself and the wooden structure before dawn broke. But I could not turn my headlights on to see the treacherous dirt road without instantly summoning the invisible monstrosity attempting to smash through my window. I reached forward in the dark, my hands tracing the familiar layout of the dashboard controls until I found the main headlight dial. I twisted the dial firmly to the left, manually overriding the automatic running lights to ensure that the exterior bulbs would remain completely dark even when the vehicle was running. I gripped the ignition key with a sweaty hand, took a deep breath, and turned it forward, praying that whatever anomalous interference had stalled the engine was tied to the creature's presence and had dissipated with the darkness. The starter motor ground for a long, agonizing second before the powerful engine roared to life, settling into a smooth, steady idle that vibrated reassuringly through the floorboards. I shifted the transmission into drive, staring out through the windshield into the absolute black void of the forest, and slowly pressed the accelerator pedal, allowing the heavy cargo van to roll forward completely blind. Driving a heavy vehicle down a narrow, winding logging road without any headlights is an exercise in pure, nerve-wracking terror, relying entirely on the faint, barely perceptible contrast between the dark dirt path and the slightly darker shapes of the massive trees lining the shoulders. I kept the speed incredibly low, my hands constantly adjusting the steering wheel as I felt the tires slipping into ruts and bouncing over exposed roots, terrified of sliding into a ditch or crashing head-on into an invisible trunk. I navigated the blind path for several agonizing minutes, successfully putting a considerable distance between the van and the location of the bulletin board, when a sharp, unexpected curve suddenly materialized out of the darkness ahead. My survival instincts overrode my logical planning, and I instinctively slammed my heavy boot down onto the brake pedal to slow the van's momentum before steering into the invisible turn. The moment my foot depressed the brake pedal, the bright red taillights mounted on the rear of the van flared to life, casting a brilliant crimson glow into the swirling dust behind the vehicle. A massive, jarring impact slammed into the rear doors of the cargo van, a force so powerful it caused the rear tires to briefly lose traction and sent a sickening crunch of buckling metal echoing through the interior of the cargo bay. The vehicle violently lurched backward, the engine screaming as it fought against a sudden, immense weight dragging against the rear bumper, completely halting my forward progress despite my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The creature had returned the exact moment the red glow of the brake lights illuminated the dirt road behind me, and the red light was bright enough to reach the bulletin board in the distance, allowing the entity to materialize and grab hold of the fleeing van. I could hear the thick metal of the rear doors groaning and tearing under the grip of massive, invisible hands. The suspension groaning as the rear of the vehicle was physically lifted several inches off the ground. The rear tires spun helplessly in the dirt, kicking up clouds of dust as the creature anchored itself to the road and pulled the heavy van backward with impossible strength, trying to drag me back toward the illuminated board. I realized with absolute certainty that if I kept my foot on the brake pedal to maintain control of the vehicle on the steep, uneven terrain, the red light would sustain the creature's existence until it managed to rip the rear doors open. I ripped my foot off the brake pedal, abandoning any attempt to control the speed of the van, and the bright red taillights instantly extinguished, plunging the rear of the vehicle back into total darkness. The immense dragging weight vanished immediately, the heavy rear tires slamming back down onto the dirt road and finding traction, launching the cargo van forward with a violent jolt that snapped my head back against the headrest. I knew then that I had to navigate the rest of the treacherous, winding descent through the dense forest without ever touching the brake pedal again, relying entirely on downshifting the transmission to manage my speed, because illuminating the rear of the van would bring the creature back instantly. The remainder of the drive was a chaotic, terrifying blur of maintaining speed while steering blindly through the dark, trusting the heavy tires to absorb the impacts of unseen potholes and holding my breath as the branches of unseen trees scraped violently against the sides of the van. I kept my hand resting on the gear shifter, manually dropping the transmission into lower gears whenever the van began to pick up too much momentum on the downhill slopes, using the resistance of the engine to slow the vehicle instead of activating the deadly red taillights. I drove until I was sure I am far away enough from the board, my muscles cramping from the intense physical tension and my eyes burning from straining to see through the black void, until I finally saw the faint, artificial yellow glow of distant streetlights bleeding through the tree canopy ahead. The rough, uneven dirt road eventually smoothed out into solid, paved asphalt, and I steered the heavy cargo van out of the oppressive tree line and onto a wide, well-lit rural highway, the sudden exposure to the bright streetlights feeling incredibly jarring after spending so long in the dark. I drove for another 20 miles before I found a large, brightly illuminated commercial rest stop, pulling the van into a parking space under a massive halogen light pole and shutting the engine off, my entire body shaking so violently I could barely pull the keys from the ignition. I stepped out of the cab, my legs feeling like lead, and walked around to the back of the cargo van to inspect the damage, needing visual proof that the entire ordeal hadn't been a complex hallucination. The heavy metal of the rear doors was severely buckled and warped, bending outward as if an immense force had attempted to pry them open from the center seam. Pressed deeply into the thick dust coating the damaged metal were the clear, unmistakable impressions of massive, elongated hands, the long, spindly fingers scraping deep grooves into the paint exactly where the invisible entity had grabbed the vehicle to stop my escape. I am sitting inside the brightly lit convenience store of the rest stop right now, drinking a cup of hot coffee to steady my trembling hands, typing this long account on my phone while I wait for the sun to rise completely before I even consider getting back on the road. I need to warn anyone who drives these isolated routes for a living, anyone who relies on navigation applications that reroute you onto forgotten dirt paths through old, dense forests in the middle of the night. If you ever find yourself driving down a dark logging road and your headlights illuminate a perfectly pristine wooden bulletin board filled with missing person posters, you need to turn your headlights off immediately, put your vehicle in gear, and drive away in the dark. Do not stop to read the flyers, Do not look for your own face